Hey, we'd like to let everybody know that during the course of recording this episode, at some points, Patty's video, I don't want to say froze, but it certainly didn't catch up to the audio. So hopefully, all the content is there. If you're listening by audio, you'll hear everything. If you're watching through the video, you may see that happen. Actually, you're probably going to see that happen, even though that I'm going to be editing as much as I can. So just give you a heads up on that. And here's the episode. Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist herself, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I am doing just fine. It has made it over 17 degrees. I'm so excited.
I'm not excited because when I look at the long-term forecast, I don't see for the next 2 weeks, which is as far as it goes out, I don't see any temperatures above freezing.
Well, it's better than it has been. We were 10 below zero night before last.
I guess comparatively, yes, but I've made it abundantly clear that I am not a fan of winter.
I know.
But enough about the weather. If you are new to the podcast, please do consider clicking the subscribe button on whatever platform you're on. Click the like, and that's all we could ask of you. And hopefully you enjoy our content, and we'll continue to come along with us weekly or bi-weekly, however it happens to be. Lately, it seems to be bi-weekly, but we'll take it as it comes, right?
We will. And last week it was mostly my fault. I live in the middle of nowhere and my internet connection was in and out really bad.
Oh, that's okay. That was the last weekend was the snowmageddon that came through the
Yeah.
2,000-mile swath across the country. So yeah, we were both hit pretty hard in that one. But anyway, I think now is where I ask, what's our topic for today?
Well, we're going to visit the Men in Black, but in a slightly different way than most people do it. So I've been digging a lot of information up, and I think it's a really interesting series of events that they really don't talk about, and a different chronology for the Men in Black.
Fair enough.
I know that doesn't give anybody great answers, but that's because, if I tell you this, you're going to understand in about 10 minutes where we're headed. So I have a cat over here who thinks that he should be on camera. So he's just chasing back and forth. So if I look like I'm fidgeting, I'm actually trying to force the cat to not become the guy who's telling the stories tonight, because he's determined.
Mm-hmm. Well, they do have a mind of their own whenever they get the shared brain cell.
They do. And this one's decided he's a movie star today. For my work, I work from home. So I do my job from on a computer. And sometimes I have the same argument with him there, which is that he's not going to get to do the sessions. I'm not sure why he suddenly loves to do that stuff, but he does. So there were, recently I was doing some reading about Mothman, Point Pleasant, stuff like that. And during the reading, something started to sort of stand out for me. And that's how we ended up in this set of stories that I'm about to tell.
Okay.
There were three events that happened in the 40s and 50s. And well, these three events, I think, opened portals. Let me explain. The first of the events is going to be Jack Parsons. So Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, two figures that we probably don't know a whole lot about today. L. Ron Hubbard's probably the more well-known Scientology.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But Jack Parsons at the time was actually the more well-known. So Jack Parsons started the Jet Propulsion Institute, and his specialty was, and he is self-taught. He is absolutely, a forerunner and a genius in this field. But he's also something else. He is heavily into thelema, and that was started in England, and he's fascinated with it. And he begins to write letters to the great 666 himself, and they begin a correspondence about thelema, which is a sex magic cult. To make it easy for you to understand, there is a belief in some of the in some areas of magic that sex magic is one of the most powerful magics there is. And I could go into all of that, but that would take us an hour. We're going to skip that part, just giving you the background on that. So he's talking to Crowley, who is the great 666, and Crowley tells him, I think you're the one meant to do the Babylon Rising ritual. Now, very, very quickly, the Babylon Rising ritual is supposed to tear a hole in the fabric between Earth and other planes of existence, and through there will come this creature known as Babylon. And it is a 3-month-long exercise. It starts in January, ends in March of the year he does it. So it's not something for the faint of heart. Part of it's performed at what's called Grimm Castle, which is actually Parsons' home. He inherited his home from his grandparents, and it looks like a castle. And so people begin to call it Grimm Castle because there's all kinds of witchcraft and satanic stuff going on at this particular facility. But the rest of it is done in the desert. Parsons is the guy doing the magic, and L. Ron Hubbard is his scribe. Easiest way I know to explain it. So they begin this process along with Parsons' fiance or girlfriend. And what they hope to do is that they're going to give birth to this entity. They both believe that they actually succeed, that this entity has entered this plane of existence. They describe her. She's petite and slim, long red hair. And very shortly thereafter, their relationship breaks up. L. Ron Hubbard steals Parsons' girlfriend and a lot of his inheritance and takes off for Florida to become the dude who starts Scientology. Parsons is kind of devastated by everything that happens. And he's still working Thelemian magic. And then his new girlfriend will tell the story this way, that Parsons was working in the garage one day when she heard a loud explosion, and she went running out there, and he blew himself up with mixing a new set of fuels. But it's really interesting because whenever you look at the crime scene photos and stuff, you'll see that it looks like something blew up from below the basement or from below the garage, and it blew upward. Everything went upward. And the floorboards are like thrown upward. And it's just, it's interesting. It's almost as though it went, from below the floor of the garage. So Parsons falls into history. And his craziness with the Thelemian magic and all of that had been such that the government, which had been supporting him, had decided not too far in the past that they were going to take the Jet Propulsion Laboratory from him and buy him out. No questions asked. He was definitely going to be bought out. So that said, that is our first event. Our second event is the Philadelphia experiment. So those who don't know, Tesla was among the people who were working on something called the Philadelphia experiment. Very quickly, I'm just going to give you the little bit of background. Tesla begins to suspect that what's going on is dangerous, that they are not going to be able to create a invisible ship. I know that sounds crazy, but that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to create a situation where a real battleship could become invisible, and when it becomes invisible, it could then pass through like enemy waters, things like that, without anybody seeing it. And the story is that Tesla comes to them and he says, look, we need to scrap this whole thing. This is bad. I'm telling you, people are going to die. The work isn't right. It just isn't right. He refuses to work on it. They hire other people to complete the project. And if any of the story is accurate, and I'm going to tell you that I believe it is personally, what happens is they the experiment, the ship supposedly in port in Philadelphia, that's why it's called the Philadelphia experiment. They have it legally listed as being elsewhere. And they, the ship shimmers and disappears. And the other ships, there's another ship there that's watching all of this to see how this works. And the other ship reports that it blinks out, it blinks in, it blinks out, it blinks in. Elsewhere, at another port in Norfolk, ship supposedly blinks into the water there. Again, there's already ships there waiting to see what happens, and then it disappears and appears, disappears. The rest of that story is that whenever the ship reappears in Philadelphia, there are people fused into the fuselage. There are people melted into the walls. There are people who are insane and blood dripping out their eyes and their ears. And it's just horrible. And the entire thing supposedly gets scrapped, but I don't believe the government, so I don't think it got scrapped. What Tesla believed was going to happen is that there would be a rip in the time and that other portals would rip open and we would lose our chain of history moving forward. That's our second event. And our third event is Montauk. So anybody who's ever watched Stranger Things, which is the easiest way for me to reference it, it's a modern reference. The United States government in the early 1970s, as part of the MK Ultra project, which was 127 separate projects put into the title MK Ultra in Montauk off of New York, which is a little island off of New York. They built a military base, it was an Air Force base, and underneath the Air Force base, they built a another base, if you will. I mean, there's no other word for it. There, they were working on a couple things, and this is straight MK Ultra stuff. They were working on mind control, but they were working on something else as well. They were working on how to let people travel through portals in time. I know all of these things sound crazy. Now, the government has always denied the Philadelphia experiment, although there are people who've come forward who have some evidence of it. Then when you talk about the stuff with Parsons, that is well known and everybody laughs at it and says, oh, you know, he was just being insane. But there's nobody that ever really argues it either. And then with Montauk, there's a lot of evidence that Montauk actually happened. It's the most recent event. The base still sits there. There are it's chained up doors and stuff on that base that go down into the earth. They know that there's another set of bases underneath it. The government doesn't even deny that part of it. And we have eyewitnesses. There are a couple people who claim to have witnessed each of these events. The first event was Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard kept notes throughout the entire thing, and his notes and his own conversations that, yep, this happened, this is what happened to us, and and the woman who was there, who later on runs off with Hubbard, she also verifies in her testimony that, yep, this is what happened, we saw it. And then there are a couple people who claim to have been on part of the Philadelphia experiment. There's a gentleman whose name is actually Carl Allen. He would use an alias for a while, but eventually he came forward and identified himself, who was on that ship at that time. And he's the one who tells that story and offers some interesting details. And like I said, with Montauk, it's just there's a lot of people who've come forward who claim to be what they call the Montauk Boys. These are, interestingly enough, they all told the same story, even if they came up independently. And again, this is early 80s, late 70s, when they start talking. And there's not an internet, not like we know it today. So the fact that they came from different places and they heard somebody was talking about Montauk, And then they came forward, and one of the things that they consistently talked about was the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair was a specifically built chair wired with electromagnetic fields that could cause a person to jump into the fabric of time and land somewhere else and then be forced back, which sounds as insane as it could possibly be. Except there are people who testify that they traveled it and got back, and there are others who testify that they knew of people who were part of the Montauk Boy, basically homeless kids and what have you, that they gathered up and used for the experiments because nobody'd miss them. And that they knew of people who went and never came back through time. And that it caused tears in time. Now, why is that important? It's going to be important in a few minutes, because, as I said, I was reading on the Mothman prophecies and all of this, and I would have told you I had a better than cursory idea about John Keel and what happened. I would have been wrong to say that, because I learned a lot about what happened. So one of the things that happens is that John Keel is a guy who's, he's researching, and he's fascinated with all the research. He begins to hear stories about alien ships and all kinds of craziness going on, and he becomes a researcher, and that's what he's doing. He's a writer, he's a journalist, and he becomes a researcher. And he's just basically checking out UFO sightings. He's not the only one before the Mothman stuff begins. And one of the first sightings that makes its way into the public is something called the Maury Island incident. And this took place in Washington State. Now, basically, here's the story. Supposedly, there was this ship on the water, in the late night, and a spaceship, for lack of a better word, comes out of nowhere, hovers above this boat with like 4 people on it and a dog. And all of a sudden, it seems like this flying saucer begins to like tip and tumble, like it can't keep its balance. And then something starts flying out of it. They describe it as looking like thousands of pieces of newspaper flying down, floating down, but they're gathered up later on, and they are actually very, very thin, pliable sheets of metal. And then something bursts out of this UFO, and they describe it as hot flaming rocks, and it hits the ship. All this stuff hits the ship in the water, and the dog on board is killed. Somebody else on board is badly injured. They have to put into port. They need to get medical treatment. They're hysterical about what's happening. And the captain, his name's Dahl, D-A-H-L. Captain Dahl had his 15-year-old son on that ship, and that's where the dog came from. The boy and the dog had happened to come out on the ship with him that night. So he takes his injured crewman and his son and the other man, and they get off the ship. They go to the hospital. The dog is obviously dead. He's going to deal with that later. And all of a sudden, the military is showing up. And they're like, what happened? Tell us what you saw. So he does at first. I mean, he begins to tell you all that stuff. And then he realizes how insane they sound. And the next couple days, he's being followed by the military. And then after this starts to all calm down, and he stops talking and he does everything he's told, he's on board his ship again. He's trying to just, keep moving forward. And the military has, to his knowledge, to the best of his knowledge anyway, left. Then as he's leaving his ship that night, so it would be about a week and a half, 2 weeks after the events, a man in a black suit walks up to him He's got a black suit, black tie, white shirt, glasses, and he says, "Mr. Dahl, could I have a word with you?" But he looks and sounds odd. Like the way Mr. Dahl described it, he said it was like watching something that was in a bad costume. So like his face would shift and stuff like this. The skin on it would shift and stuff. So he pauses. He's not really sure what to do. And the guy pins him with these black eyes that don't seem to dilate or move. And in a very mechanical voice says, "I've come to tell you that you need to keep your mouth shut." And the shiver of fear that went through Dahl was insane. He's really kind of scared about what's going on. He doesn't understand it. He's like, I haven't been saying anything to anybody. I don't know what you're talking about. And he says, "I'm talking about what happened the other night in the sky. You need to keep your mouth shut. What happened to the dog could happen to your son." That's enough to make any parent kind of pay attention. That basically becomes the end of it until Project Blue Book hears about it. They come out, they say, "Oh, it was a B-52 that was struggling, and he made up a lot of the other stuff, and it's all a hoax." It's the worst hoax in the history of hoaxes. However, if you knew anything about Project Blue Book, the entirety of the reason that Project Blue Book existed isn't because the Air Force wanted to identify legitimate or possibly legitimate UFO sightings. It was to shut them all down. J. Allen Hynek, who had worked for the Project Blue Book, when he left there, confessed that he wrote off many viable accounts because the military paid him to do so. So we know that that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And then, of course, the modern UFO flap begins. So now we've got Arnold, who spots the flying saucers. So Arnold is a guy who's flying his private plane across country, and he gets to the airport and he has this insane report, and he says, "I saw these ships in the sky that were flying," and he makes this detailed report, and the best he can do is describe them as cup saucers upside down, flying across around him and in front of him. And there were, I believe, 6 of them. And Arnold's story catches the media's attention, and it becomes probably the best known UFO story at that point in time. And then we move on to others. And the quality of these stories are really interesting because Arnold will talk about it, and the Murray incident talks about it. This is the birth of the Man in Black. There are no known accounts prior to this. Now, the reason I started you out with the 3 events that I started you out with, Parsons and all of that, and the Philadelphia experiment, Montauk, is because there are people who believe that these 3 events ripped holes and allowed other dimensions to freely move back and forth in ways they had not been able to in the past. And that's when the Men in Black start coming. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that they did rip these holes. Up until that point, now you can make a good argument that there were UFO sightings prior to this. I'm not going to argue with you on that. But what I will tell you is the Men in Black don't seem to appear. And there are no stories from the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1700s or the 1800s. Beings are threatening. They are dressed in black clothing and threatening people who say they saw things. That does not happen until after these 3 events occur. And the interesting to me is the fact that one of the first people to realize there was a pattern would be John Keel, best known for the Mothman prophecies. So John Keel's looking into UFO sightings and what have you. He begins to hear these really interesting stories and about these Men in Black. the witnesses who saw the man in black at the Maury event, not just the captain, but people that were on the dock, would describe him as having pale, expressionless, inhuman face. A pale, expressionless, inhuman face. And again, one of them also said it was like he was in a bad suit. The skin was moving independently, like bad cloth. This felt more like a paranormal event. There was a lot of fear, ungrounded, somebody walking up and saying to you at first, just can I talk to you, shouldn't cause you to feel like you need to run. But that's exactly how this man said he felt. And one of the things that Keel begins to take note of and start making notes about are things like these beings are like a facsimile of a person. So they're not entirely human. They usually have waxy or pale or expressionless skin. They just don't move like a human being. A lot of times they will offer you information that nobody has any way of knowing. Maybe something like, I know what you said to your wife last night. Like you're sitting at home by yourself. How does he know what I said? But then they tell you what you said. They have inappropriate patterns of speech. So sometimes it'll be a cold, monotone, or almost mechanical voice. Sometimes instead of talking, if there's a couple of them, instead of saying I'm Joe and this is Fred, they'll say I'm 1 and this is 7. And you're like, what? I'm Officer 1 and this is 7. That makes no sense. They'll often use outdated language, antiquated language, unnatural manners about the way they speak. There's patterns of how we relate to each other. Some cultures, you don't meet a person's eyes. Other cultures, you're supposed to look them in the eye. These beings, whatever they are, they don't move like that. Like they don't have any social norms. They don't exhibit any social patterns that are recognizable. If you meet a person and they keep looking down, like I read people for a living, that's what I do. And, I can tell from the tone of their voice or the way they move their bodies, a lot of stuff about them, maybe from the culture they're from or how they relate to other human beings, things like that. These beings don't have any discernible pattern. They often will be oddly dressed. So imagine one of these beings coming up and he's got a bald head and he's got these big black glasses and he says things to you like, it's right up into your face and he's talking to you and he's like touching invisible hair or something. They do things that just don't make sense. The other item that seems to be particularly consistent is that feeling of physical distress from the witnesses. They always talk about fear. A lot of them will describe that as soon as this being left, I had this most intense migraine I've ever had in my life. Or they'll sometimes say that they fall into a paralysis. They're not able to move. And there are other accounts where they'll talk about as soon as this being appeared, it became very icy cold. I was freezing the whole time it was in the room with me. They almost always come in a black car with no license plates on it. Usually it's like a 1950s Cadillac or something along those lines. And there's no noise that comes from the vehicle. Now, I love old cars, and I promise you a 1950s Cadillac purrs, but it makes a sound. People will talk about how there's no sound. You don't even hear the sound of the car crunching in the gravel when it leaves. No sound, like it's not really there. It's just something that's in a delusion or an illusion that you're seeing. And Keel is beginning to notice all of this. He's taking account of all of this. And then he hits the story that starts him down a darker road, and that's the story of the Mothman prophecies. So basically, he heard a story that in West Virginia, this beast had been seen, which we now call the Mothman. There's a series of witnesses, and he decides to go down there from New York, where he lives, and just do some interviewing. And I'm sure most of you have seen or have heard a little bit about it because there was a movie made. And of course, there's book after book on this particular subject. he goes down and he begins to talk to these people. And as he's talking to these people that claim to have seen it, he can see they're traumatized. Something really did happen. Whatever this is, even if it's a complete fake, the people who saw it don't believe it's a fake at that moment, and he knows that. But as he's talking to these people and he's beginning to look at his notes from his old interviews, and he's looking at the stuff coming out from these people in Point Pleasant area, he begins to realize there's a lot of coordination here. And he begins to think about this in a different way. These people are describing these things as demonic. In 1967, he begins to talk about and start writing about this. He also talks about them as a manifestation of unknown non-human intelligence that manipulates human perception. And he moves further down as he starts to really collect the data. And although nobody talks about this until maybe 10 years ago, he says, I don't think these are from outer space. Everybody's telling him these are UFOs and these things are beings that come from outer space. And he's like, no, I don't think they do. His observations begin to make him suspect that this is something completely different. He describes them as demonic. Dark, exotic facial features, sinister appearance, the ability to appear or disappear instantly. Intent seems to be to cause terror, confusion, and fear, rather than just promoting government secrecy. Reports suggest that the Men in Black phenomena may be linked to older, more spiritual and interdimensional phenomena rather than a human intelligence, and there's a blurring of the line between ufology and demonology. John Keel. He talks about the parallels with traditional demonic lore. For example, there's a gentleman by the name who's a researcher, Peter Rosowich, who explored the idea of the Men in Black experience and draws parallels to the devil, relating this to folk figures. He's intimidating, he's secretive in nature. These beings demand silence, and they mirror ancient fears of infernal beings that are making a pact, you will not talk or else. And they also use intimidation and threats. The physical phenomena. The Men in Black often are attributed to some sort of demonic event. A poltergeist activity will often happen around them. Once they've come to you and have interacted with you, they seem to be able to trace your energy down, and they can find you. If you move across the country and you think, I'm safe now, nobody knows, I changed my name, I did all these things, they'll call you on the phone and say, I understand you moved to California. I'll be seeing you tomorrow. Imagine how terrifying that is. There are stories of that and worse. And we're going to talk about it. John Keel went from being a researcher throughout this series of events to being a participant in these events. Once these beings realized what Keel was up to with the documentation, they began to come after him. A really insane thing to say. We're going to get to that. Ufology and Christian researchers both point out that these things seem to work from an occultic background. They mimic humanity, but they are not human. People will talk about, I felt like it was an empty suit standing in front of me. There was no energy. All of us do this. We read energy. We just don't know we're reading energy. But have you ever met somebody that just made you feel funny? Like you just were uncomfortable around that person, or other people that you feel almost like you can tell them anything the first time you meet them. You read the energy around that person. We're all surrounded by an electromagnetic field. These beings don't seem to be. People talk about the fact that they feel off, that they have a sense of dread when they are around them. They are non-human in behavior. There are just so many things about them that go back to the old folklore of satanic things. And then In 1975, the Mothman Prophecies, the book, is launched. And in that book, versus the movie really just focuses on narrowly on the events in that happened in those few weeks down in West Virginia. But I want to talk a little bit about things that are more interesting to me. They're just little facts woven into the book. Yes, the book is really about Point Pleasant, about the events that occur there. But some of those events occur elsewhere as well. And they start occurring to John Keel once he starts popping his head into this whole situation. Keel would eventually describe these aliens as ultra-terrestrial, rejecting the idea that they were extraterrestrial from other planets. He said these are from another dimension or frequency. They've existed alongside humanity throughout history, but I don't believe that they have been able to pass through. This is what got me to thinking back to what started this, what changed in modern times that might have allowed them to have freer reign traveling to us. And the three seminal events I kept coming up against that happened literally months. The first one happens months before Kenneth Arnold sees the saucers. A few months after that, we have the Maury incident. And all of a sudden, modern ufology takes a leap forward like it never had before. And I have to tell you, there are books out there that will talk about 17 and the 1800s and air machines and strange humans that, you know, were on these dirigibles that were pedaled and all kinds of crazy stuff. But they don't talk about men in black, and they don't talk about these beings being evil, and they don't talk about these things in the same demonic way that the modern ufology lore does. So this makes this a completely distinctly different event. Keel will begin to process through this, and as he's talking about these ultra-terrestrials, he begins to call them demonic supernaturals in his writings, in his journals, and his notes. He talks, he knows that they are often possessed by exotic, dark skin, uncanny features, not quite human appearances. He talks about, there's a book he wrote later called UFO Operation Trojan Horse. And in this book, he talks about how these things are masters of deception who stage the UFO sightings deliberately and the men in black counters to manipulate human belief systems, much like the demons of religious lore. Now, I want you to not blow through that. There's an awful lot on that particular couple sentences to unpack. Throughout history, it is believed by many cultures that Satan and demonic entities enter into human life and interfere and intervene and alter the course because of their negative actions. Every religion has lore on this. John Keel is saying that he believes these beings somehow are now walking into our dimension. They are altering our perceptions and our belief systems with their presence. And he believes they're demonic beings that have found an easier, better, and more modern way to negatively impact humanity and control its thought processes. There's a lot of people today who will believe in UFOs, who will tell you that the idea of Christ being resurrected is insane. They don't believe in religion at all, or they have a negative connotation to it. But they can somehow wrap ufology and all of this in some pseudoscience claptrap, because we don't have any information to say that it is science or not science. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying there's no evidence. And those people will go to the mat on this. But it starts with this observations and the interviews that John Keel and a couple other researchers begin to make. He will end up making friends with several other researchers. And when they lay their data together, that's when the story starts to come together really well. They
I've
have
been,
personal.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I've been thinking thinking about this, and okay, so let's say that these ultra terrestrials or other beings are in fact demons. Has anyone up to this point invoked the name of Christ, which normally, under a circumstance, would elicit some type of effect against them?
So the answer to that question is that historically speaking, during Keel's time, I don't know that answer, but I do know that in modern times, there have been ufology events where beings have retreated at the name of Christ. In fact, I know of one in particular in Western Pennsylvania where the house was being besieged by a alien man in black type situation. Due to circumstances, the homeowner ended up becoming friends with somebody who was working on a documentary on exorcisms. And the guy mentions this to one of the priests he's interviewing for his documentary. And the priest says, they're demonic. I can help this man. And so the friend goes back and says to this fella, hey, have you ever thought that these things might not be from outer space, but they might be like, more demonic or spiritual in nature? And the guy's like, yes, crazy, ridiculous. This dude's like hard science. And then something happens in his home that convinces him he needs help. So he calls his buddy up and he says, tell that priest if he's still willing to come, I'd be grateful. And during the evening that the priest and this other man who's doing the documentary shows up, the priest does a cleansing, and this event is going on when one of these beings shows up, and he specifically calls it out in the name of Christ, and it disappears. And after that, there's no activity. None. To this day. There are other stories, the Pascagoula event where two men were kidnapped and taken on board a UFO. I've mentioned this before.
Mm-hmm.
And the younger of the two was in what he described as something that looked like a large glass shower, and he could feel his soul being pulled out the top of his head. He saw a classic small gray, and the being seemed to be excited, enthusiastic about the whole thing that was going on. And he said that the guy says, I thought I knew my soul was being stolen. And all of a sudden, this being kind of scurries to the back furthest part of the room. And this guy that's in this shower thing, having his soul pulled out top of his head, looks, twists his head a little and looks. And there's what he describes as an angelic being. And the angelic being looks at him and smiles. And he said, I could feel it reversing and my soul was falling back in place. And it looked at the small gray and it was like gibbering, and you could tell it was frightened. And then the next thing the man knew, he woke up on the wharf. So those are just two examples of several more that I can offer to say that there does seem to be some indication that they fear God and they fear angelic intervention of some sort. So this is going to be a multi-part one, guys. I apologize for that, but there's just so much to unpack. We're going to talk about what happens to John Keel, about a seeker, a watcher, who makes contact with multiple investigators and multiple other people, and literally continues for almost 50 years with some of them, and other ones that harass a female radio show host into a nervous breakdown, and portal places on the earth where the veil is thin and these beings seem to be able to more readily pass. But all of that, I'm going to wait for till next week. So I hope you're interested. I hope you're curious enough to tune back in, because we have just begun to tell the stories of the demonic ultra-terrestrial men in black. So with that, I'm going to say good night to everybody, and I hope to see you next week and begin to tell those tales.